entitled Elementary and Secondary Education will come to order. Welcome everyone. I note that a quorum is present. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on charting the path to educational equity post-COVID-19. And this is an entirely remote hearing. All microphones will be kept muted as a general rule to avoid unnecessary background noise. Members and witnesses will be responsible for unmuting themselves when they are recognized to speak or when they wish to seek recognition. I also ask that members please identify themselves before they speak. Members should keep their cameras on while in the proceeding. Members shall be considered present in the proceeding when they are visible on camera, and they shall be considered not present when they are not visible on camera. The only exception to this is if they are experiencing technical difficulty and inform committee staff of such difficulty. If any member experiences technical difficulties during the hearing, you should stay connected on the platform, make sure you're muted, and use your phone to immediately call the committee's IT director, whose number was provided in advance. Should the chair experience technical difficulty or need to step away, Chairman Scott, as a member of the subcommittee, or another majority member of the subcommittee, if the Chairman Scott is not available, is hereby authorized to assume the gavel in the chair's absence. This is an entirely remote hearing, and as such, the committee's hearing room is officially closed. Members who choose to sit with their individual devices in the hearing room must wear headphones to avoid feedback, echoes, and distortion resulting from more than one person on the software platform sitting in the same room. Members are also expected to adhere to social distancing and safe healthcare guidance, including the use of masks, hand sanitizers, and wiping down their areas both before and after their presence in the hearing room. In order to ensure that the committee's 5-minute rule is adhered to, staff will be keeping track of time using the committee's field timer. The field timer will appear on its own thumbnail picture and will be named 001_timer. There will be no 1 minute remaining warning. The field timer will sound its audio alarm when time is up, and it goes really loud. Boop. Members and witnesses are asked to wrap up promptly when their time has expired. While a roll call is not necessary to establish a quorum in official proceedings conducted remotely or with remote participation, the committee has made it a practice whenever there is an official proceeding with remote participation for the clerk to call the roll to help make clear who is present at the start of the proceeding. Members should say their name before announcing they are present. This helps the clerk and also helps those watching the platform and the live stream who may experience a few seconds delay. So at this time, I ask the clerk to please call the roll.
Sablan.
Sablan is present.
Mrs. Hayes.
Hayes is present.
Mr. Grijalva.
Present.
Mr. Yarmouth.
Present.
Ms. Wilson.
Ms. Wilson is present.
Mr. DeSagne. Mr. Morelli.
Mr. Morelli is present.
Mrs. McBath.
Mrs. McBath is present.
Mr. Levin.
Levin is present.
Ms. Manning.
Fantastic.
Manning is present.
Mr. Bowman. Mr. Scott.
Scott is present.
Ranking Member Owens.
Owens is present.
Mr. Grossman. Mr. Allen. Mr. Keller.
Keller is present.
Mrs. Miller.
Miller is present.
Mr. Cawthorn. Mrs. Steele,
Still present.
Mrs. Fox.
Fox is present.
Chairman Scott, Chairman Sablon, this concludes the roll call.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And pursuant to Rule 8C, opening statements are limited to the chair and the ranking member. And this allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and provides all members with adequate time to ask questions. I recognize myself now for the purpose of making an opening statement. Today, we meet to examine the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on school communities and discuss strategies for safely reopening classrooms and addressing educational disparities. It has been just over a year since the pandemic forced schools to abruptly switch to online platforms, disrupting the education of more than 55 million students and upending our communities. Unfortunately, the consequences of this transition have extended beyond lost in-person instructions. School closures have restricted students' access to nutritious school meals and social and emotional learning opportunities. And schools are less likely to identify cases of child abuse and neglect while classrooms are closed. In my district, COVID-19 has had the greatest impact on students with disabilities, Title I qualified students, English learners, and other vulnerable students that already face significant challenges. Going into the pandemic, schools are predominantly serving students of color faced a $23 billion funding gap compared to schools predominantly serving white students. And because of this disparity, many students entered the pandemic without access to high-speed internet, dedicated devices, and other tools that are critical to remote learning. They will also return to older classrooms and campuses with much needed repairs from typhoons, some even to find school libraries losing their entire book collection, books meant for student literacy, dilapidated school facilities, including dangerously outdated ventilation systems, if they are there at all. The perfect storm of disparities has worsened inequities in unfinished learning and caused a measurable widening of achievement gaps. Research indicates Black and Latino students were 3 to 5 months behind in learning at the beginning of this school year. By the end of the school year, they could be 6 to 12 months behind compared to 4 to 8 months for white students. GAO reporting found that school districts struggled to provide education and services for students with disabilities and English learners. Further, a new survey by the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, found that more than half of all Black, Latino, and Asian fourth graders learned in a fully remote environment. Another survey showed that only about a quarter of Pacific Islanders receive full-time in-person instruction. In comparison, 25% of white students learn fully remotely, and nearly half of white students receive full-time in-person instructions. Students with disabilities have also disproportionately suffered from this pandemic in the wake of the Trump administration's failed COVID-19 response. Without adequate guidance from the department, schools struggled to maintain the special education services that students with disabilities needed to access quality education in a remote learning environment. Today, schools also face challenges to reopening classrooms for students with disabilities who may be more vulnerable to the virus. For example, the NAEP 2021 survey showed that 40% of schools prioritize students with disabilities for full-time in-person instructions in the 4th and 8th grades. Yet students with disabilities have not received in-person instructions at rates noticeably higher than other subgroup of students. This continued disparities make clear that to ensure that all schools and students recover from this pandemic, we must target relief and resources to underserved students who need them most. Over the past year, Congress has taken historic steps toward that goal through 3 major relief packages. the Coronavirus Aid Relief and Economic Security Act, or the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplement to Appropriations Act, and the most recent, the American Rescue Plan Act. Combined together, these packages secured nearly $200 billion in urgent relief for schools. The funding has been critical for covering the increased costs of the pandemic and preparing for the $300 billion shortfall in state and local budgets. To date, reduced state revenue has already cost more than 1 million education jobs. The American Rescue Plan specifically makes the most significant one-time investment in K-12 education in our nation's history. Under President Biden, Congress swiftly passed this legislation after school communities spent months calling for additional funding to reopen schools safely and support students. The nearly $130 billion of flexible funding in this package will help schools take the necessary steps to safely reopen and stay open. And it will help students overcome lost time in the classrooms as well as severe trauma, hunger, and homelessness. The American Rescue Plan funding will also help Congress fulfill its long-standing commitment to meeting the needs of students with disabilities. Specifically, the package dedicates $3 billion to ensure that K-12 students with disabilities can access the free and appropriate public education they have a right to, and toddlers with disabilities can access the services they need to be ready to enter the school system. The lessons from our pandemic response so far have provided a valuable foundation for Congress to take the next steps towards educational equity. For example, we need accurate data from statewide assessments to understand the full scope of this pandemic. Without this data, we cannot accurately target relief funding to support school communities where racial achievement gaps are greatest. We must also make a systemic reforms to our K-12 education system to fully address educational disparities. And this includes repairing crumbling school infrastructure, confronting the growing resegregation of public schools, and making other long-term investments to address educational disparities. Today, we will discuss the work we still have ahead to close persistent achievement gaps and ensure a recovery from this pandemic where every student succeeds. I want to thank our witnesses again for being with us, and I now yield to the ranking member, the full committee ranking member, Dr. Fox, for her opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, I will take that as ranking member. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for all our witnesses for joining us. Ensuring all children have
could the gentleman suspend for a minute?
Yes.
Dr. Fox will make her opening statement.
Okay.
She's just trying to unmute herself. Okay. Dr. Fox, there should be the microphone should be on your lower right hand. If you're using a computer, you
Lower
should
left
see,
hand, lower left hand.
yeah, left hand corner facing it, Dr. Fox.
There we go.
Banyan, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes, yes.
I have no sound.
Okay, Dr. Fox, I apologize.
Sound has been cut off here.
Mr. Owens is actually going to make his opening statements, and then on the questioning, you're going to be ahead of Mr. Owens. So I apologize, my mistake. So could I go back and recognize Mr. Owens, please? Thank you, Dr. Fox. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Owens, you have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for our witnesses for joining us. Ensuring all children have opportunities to achieve the American dream must never be a partisan issue. All students, regardless of zip code or socioeconomic status, should have the freedom to attend the school that meets their unique needs, setting them up for lifelong success. I grew up in the Deep South in the time of Jim Crow and the KKK. Racial segregation and inequities in education are not just the chapters in a history book for me. I lived and experienced them firsthand. I'm the child of educators. My father received his PhD from Ohio State University and taught agronomy at Florida A&M. My mother was a junior high school teacher. I was taught from a young age that the importance of education and hard work. I firmly believe education is the key to unlocking our children's future of possibilities. Tragically, the COVID-19 pandemic has served as a major setback for K-12 students nationwide. The purpose of today's hearing might be to discuss educational equity post-COVID-19, but there can be no educational equity when classrooms doors remain shut. Too many poor families, many of them students of color, as well as those with disabilities, have been left with no educational options other than to wait on the bureaucrats to, quote, follow the science and reopen schools. The Biden administration and this Congress have failed these families. Every day, our inaction worsens the educational disparities in our communities, which over time will contribute to widening opportunities and wealth gaps. The best way to help struggling families is to give them more freedom to make choices for their children's education, not by shutting them out of schools and closing doors of great opportunities. While numerous states and schools have listened to the science and implemented proper safety precautions to offer students and families safe in-person instructions, too many students are trapped in school districts that refuse to reopen, causing irreversible harm to our nation's children. This is far from equity, and we must do better. That's why House Republicans call for a bipartisan investigation into the effects of school closures are having on our children with disabilities. In a letter to Chairman Clayman, Maloney, Scott, and Pallone, my fellow Republicans wrote, and I quote, "Students with disabilities are falling behind. States and localities are not meeting even the minimal requirements. If states and or localities are violating federal civil rights laws to the detriment of students, they must be investigated and their actions corrected," close quote. Closed classrooms are also increased mental health problems among the students. CDC data shows that mental health visits to the emergency room increased between 24 and 31% for children from March to October of last year. Additionally, 2020 analysis by McKinsey & Company estimates that children of color may lose up to 1 year of learning compared to white students losing 4 to 8 months, with an average overall learning loss of 9 months. These numbers are jaw-dropping. We cannot allow future generations to fall further behind while the Biden administration tiptoes around the radical demands of teacher unions. Embarrassingly, the United Teachers of Los Angeles, UTLA, demanded a host of left-wing priorities such as Medicare for all, defunding the police, wealth and millionaire taxes, at least $50 billion in school nationwide, housing security and security school moratorium, and a safety prerequisites in our in-person return to schools. But rather than address these outrageous wish lists, which has nothing to do with reopening schools, the Democrats have claimed that we all want schools to reopen. Their actions or lack thereof speaks louder than words. In addition, the Biden administration seems to change their tune daily on reopening schools. Even the Washington Post labeled their messaging as a muddled mess. Let's follow the science. Last week, the CDC reversed its course on 6 feet of social distancing, admitting that their previous guideline was politically motivated. This comes after CDC Director Walensky's statement that schools could reopen before all teachers are vaccinated, a statement that was later reversed because of the pressures from teachers union. Like the CDC, congressional Democrats are willing to bend the facts on their crusade to politicize our children's education. Democrats rammed through their so-called CDC relief bill, even though this body had already allocated significantly more funding than the CDC said was necessary to safely reopen schools. Even worse, the funds appropriated through this partisan legislation have nothing to do with reopening schools this spring. The data is clear. The longer schools stay closed, the further children fall behind, particularly those in disadvantaged groups. Yet the Biden administration and Democrats continue to prioritize unions over students and politics over science. This is no way to lead our country through this unprecedented crisis. This is no way to chart a path forward toward educational equality. The science is clear. Congress provided an abundance of funding, yet children are still stuck learning behind a screen, forcing our youngest and most vulnerable to overcome insurmountable barriers to success. For far too long, Congress has been bitterly divided on partisan lines. Our kids deserve better. I hope we can come together, not as Republicans and Democrats, but as parents, grandparents, and patriotic Americans to put the well-being of our children first. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, particularly Mrs. Jennifer Dale, who will offer testimonies on her testimony with harmful and lengthy school closures and how it has impacted her family. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Owens, for your statement. I just would like to say that here in the ground in the Marianas, the CARES Act and the American Rescue Act has allowed our teachers to come back to 40-hour work weeks, and schools actually reopen for face-to-face instructions. And they're now in the process of making plans for summer schools, identifying students who need help and bringing them into summer schools. But thank you for your statement anyway. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written statements to the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. on May the 8th, 2021. I will now introduce the witnesses. Mark H. Morial is President and CEO of the National Urban League, the nation's largest historic civil rights and urban advocacy organization. He served as the highly successful and popular mayor of New Orleans, as well as the president of the United States Conference of Mayors. He previously was a Louisiana state senator and was an attorney in New Orleans. He is a leading voice on the national stage in the battle for jobs, education, housing, and voting rights equity. He's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania with a degree in economics and holds a degree from degree in economics and African American studies, and holds a law degree from Georgetown University. I think the live stream, the chair has been informed. Yeah, the chair has been informed that the live stream is down, and House rules require that we suspend until it is back up. So it will pause momentarily. Members and witnesses should maintain their connection to the platform as the hearing will continue as soon as live stream is back up. Thank you. left off, I was introducing the witnesses, and I think I was just saying that Mr. Morales also got a law degree from Georgetown University. Ms. Jennifer Dale is a mother to 3 school-age children and resides in Lake Oswego, Oregon. Oh, my great-grandchildren live there too. In her community, Ms. Dale is active in volunteering with nonprofits that serve children and people with disabilities, including serving on the board of Community Vision, which supports independence for people with disabilities in employment and housing. Last fall, Ms. Dale formed a group with other families in the community to push for the return to in-person instructions. Her group, Clack to School, named after Clackamas County, has merged with Let Them Play, Let Oregon Learn, and opening PDX to become the largest Oregon coalition of families advocating to reopen schools, numbering 35,000 families statewide. Celine Almazan, I hope I got that right, is the legal director for the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, COPAA. COPA started as a small membership and training organization for attorneys and advocates where parents could find the help they needed to fight for the rights of their children, and now is nationally recognized for harnessing the strength and determination of family attorneys, advocates, related professionals, and students. Ms. Almazan has represented students with families for over 30 years, and in addition to her work with COPA, maintains a private practice focusing on parent and student representation in special education matters and matters involving violations of the Individuals with Disabilities Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. She has extensive experience training families, teachers, school administrators, attorneys, and advocates on legal issues related to special education law, as well as disability discrimination issues. I am also pleased to recognize my colleague, Representative Federica Wilson, to briefly introduce her constituent who is appearing before us as a witness today. I yield to 30 seconds to Ms. Wilson to introduce the witness, please. Ms. Wilson, are you, yeah, Federica, please, 30 seconds. I think you need to unmute your microphone. I can't hear you. Can you hear me, Federica? Not if you can.
I hear you.
Okay, oh, now I hear you too. Let's go. Introduce your witness, please.
Good afternoon.
Oh, yes.
Thank you, Chairman Sablon. I am so proud to introduce my friend, 5,000 role model mentor, and Miami-Dade County Public Schools Superintendent, Alberto Cavallo. He is the best, and Miami-Dade County Public Schools are open for business and have been for a long time. Children attend according to parental choice. He has served as superintendent of Miami-Dade County Public Schools, the nation's 4th largest school system since September 2008, a record of exemplary service. He is a nationally recognized expert on education, transformation, finance, and leadership development. During his tenure, Miami-Dade County Public Schools has become one of the nation's highest performing urban schools. And because of the 5,000 role models, Black boys outperform their counterparts in other urban districts. The district has also been named as the 2014 College Board Advanced Placement Equity and Excellence District of the Year, as well as the 2012 winner of the Broad Prize for Urban Education. Mr. Cavallo serves on the National Assessment Governing Board. He also serves as a committee member of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and as an advisory committee member to the Harvard Program on Education, Policy, and Governance. Welcome to the Education and Labor Committee, Superintendent Cavallo, all the way from Miami-Dade. We're looking forward to your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. And to the witnesses again, welcome and good afternoon. But we appreciate the witnesses you're participating today and look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we have read your written statements and they will appear in full in the hearing record. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8D and committee practice, each of you is asked to please limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. I also remind the witnesses that pursuant to Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1001, it is illegal to knowingly and willfully falsify any statement, representation, writing, document, or material fact presented to Congress or otherwise conceal or cover up a material fact. Before you begin your testimony, please remember to unmute your microphone. During your testimony, staff will be keeping track of time and a timer will sound when time is up. Please be attentive to the time, wrap up when your time is over, and remute your microphone.
I'm about to testify before Congress.
If any of you experience technical difficulties during your testimony or later in the hearing, you should stay connected on the platform. Make sure you are muted and use your phone to immediately call the committee's IT director, whose number was provided to you in advance. We will let all the witnesses make their presentations before we move to member questions. When answering a question, please remember to unmute your microphone. And I will first recognize Mark Morrell, please. Mr. Morrell, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to Ranking Member Owens and to each member of the subcommittee. Thank you. It's always an honor to appear before our elected representatives. I also want to acknowledge the leadership of Chairman Scott, with whom we work for many, many years. I am president of the National Urban League. I'm also the father of 3 and the son of a 2nd grade teacher. So the issues that you are considering today are most important to me. The National Urban League serves children in this nation in 90 communities, 90 affiliates serving 300 communities in 36 states. We provide out of time or after school services to hundreds of thousands of young people each and every year. At the community level, we are advocates. We are advocates for both excellence and equity, and have been actively involved in ensuring the successful implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act adopted by the Congress several years ago. And I appreciate the opportunity to share just for a moment our perspective on the path to educational equity in this COVID-19 environment. Regrettably, Black and brown children have faced a disproportionate burden as a result of this pandemic. Black people are more likely to contract, be hospitalized, and die from COVID-19. Black workers are more likely to be in fields with the most layoffs due to the pandemic. Black children are far more likely than their white counterparts to lack the internet access and the devices necessary to receive adequate remote instruction, a term we call the homework gap. Information that we've received from communities across the nation indicate that as many as 20 to 40% of children in many urban school districts have been completely cut off from learning since the pandemic has begun. Now, this is on top of the systemic inequities that we all are aware of and we're trying to solve. And this is not unique to this pandemic. Jim Crow, the language discrimination and segregation, created a long-standing second-class system of education for children in America. I'm a son of the South. The schools I attended were integrated the first years that I attended those schools. Before Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, it was not uncommon for Black 4th grade students to use white 2nd grade hand-me-down textbooks. This history, coupled with the ways by which too many students of color have borne the brunt of this pandemic, have resulted in Black and Latino students losing an average of 10 months of instruction. Since the pandemic began and interrupted in-person teaching and learning, compared to an average of 6 months lost for instruction for white students, all of our students have lost instructional time due to this pandemic. Now, I want to thank the president and the members of the House and Senate who voted for the American Rescue Plan, which among many needed supports includes the largest federal investment in our nation's history. And as we look at how COVID-19 has widened opportunity gaps, it is the American Rescue Plan that provides the long overdue support needed for students, for schools to be able to reopen safely, for schools to be able to reintroduce students to in-person instruction, and to do it in a way that is neither haphazard nor risky nor knee-jerk. Now, those investments should support development and growth of students grounded in the principles of equity. What do I mean? Mental health supports, devices and internet connections to close a homework gap, extended learning opportunities, rigorous coursework for students of color and low-income students, diverse and qualified teachers and school leaders, restorative practices, social emotional learning, and positive behavioral supports. These are the types of things with this investment the schools of America should do in order to address the challenges of racism and to the important goal of equity. Now, to effectively leverage these resources, we need a reliable measure of what our children know. Statewide assessments provide parents and caregivers with accurate information about how their students are performing on grade level standards. Statewide assessments are not a panacea. They're not a foolproof method, but they are the best thing we have to know where our children are. I thank you for your focus on this issue and look forward to answering any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morel. I'd like now we would now hear from Ms. Jennifer Dell, please. 5 minutes, Ms. Dell. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Sablon, Ranking Member Owens, and members of the Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education Committee. Thanks for inviting me to testify at today's hearing. Lessons learned, charting the path to educational equity post-COVID-19. I really appreciate the work you're doing and being invited to testify. I'm the proud and grateful parent to 3 school-age children. My oldest daughter, Maddie, is in the 7th grade and she became a teenager this past February. My youngest child is Charlie and he's 8 years old in the 2nd grade. My middle daughter is Lizzie, age 9 in the 3rd grade, and she has Down syndrome. And I'd like to focus most of my testimony on Lizzie because I feel like she is a hidden victim of pandemic closures and policies and the prolonged school closures that have occurred. Because of Lizzie and other students like her, I believe that schools provide essential services to our communities and should have reopened in the fall of 2020. The pandemic-related shutdown of our schools, the co-curricular activities, and the youth sports caused major disruptions and destabilization for our children, many of whom could bear it the very least. And whether it was their intended purpose or not, America's public schools form the basis of our communities and deliver services and experiences that really can't be obtained anywhere else. For my daughter, Lizzie, school is where she participates in physical education and recess. It's where she receives essential therapies such as speech and occupational therapy. School is where Lizzie spends time with friends, forming the community bonds that will ultimately lead to long-term relationships and potential job opportunities for her. In her IEP, her learning specialist describes Lizzie as a 3rd grade student with a big heart, a great sense of humor, who enjoys playing with friends. She's a loyal friend who stands up for peers when they have been wronged or hurt. Lizzie loves to laugh and giggle, and she participates in soccer and dance and can be a fierce competitor when it comes to sports. In a typical year, Lizzie spends more than 80% of her day in the general education classroom. It is a seat that she has fought very hard to win and to keep. She rides our neighborhood school bus. She's greeted by friends at school who help walk her to class. They help her hang her backpack and make her lunch selection. Over the years, being included in the classroom has enabled Lizzie to learn these key routines and build a community for which she is part of the essential fabric. It's this community that she is loyal to. In a typical year, an educational aide supports Lizzie's general education by modifying her classwork and helping develop her reading and writing skills with hands-on supports. But as you know, 2020 was not a typical year. Oregon's governor rightfully shuttered school buildings last March, a year ago, when we knew very little about COVID-19. But then the governor's mandate kept our schools closed under metrics that were so hard to meet that the only path to reopening has been to change the metrics themselves rather than meet the metrics. Unfortunately, once schools closed, Lizzie's entire existence seemed to vanish from sight. No one could really see her but me, her father, and her siblings. No one could benefit from that fierce soccer competitor or that friend who would bring you a Band-Aid when you were hurt. No one could see my daughter, Lizzie. When distance learning started in September, we were provided with a Chromebook and several Zoom links for a login to Google Classroom. And like her peers, Lizzie was supposed to receive all of her instruction online. But unlike her peers, Lizzie's learning online was not possible. She's still learning sight words, learning to type on a keyboard, and learning to use a mouse. Lizzie's frustrations maxed out very quickly. And by the third week, she had actually thrown away the Chromebook without us knowing and asked for faraway school with her friends, which is what she called in-person learning. For the last 7 months, Lizzie has not been a part of any general education classroom that we fought so hard for her to be in since kindergarten. She had to stop attending general education classes entirely because they were all delivered online. Back in October, I was beginning to wonder how other families were doing this. So I posted my concerns online. My post formed the beginning of Oregon's grassroots back to school efforts and the launch of numerous local advocacy groups. We've held rallies almost weekly, hosted Zoom town halls, and initiated massive email campaigns to share our research and the science on safe reopening with school board members, superintendents, and lawmakers. For 1 year, Lizzie has been denied all physical, occupational, and speech therapies provided under her legal IEP because services are telehealth only, and they continue to be that way even after all educators have been vaccinated. She has been denied services mandated by her IEP. Maybe this was a temporary experience and hardship for some, but not for Lizzie. And this week we completed the paperwork to hold her back in the 3rd grade, where she'll be forced to make all new friends.
Okay. It's my goodness, such a wonderful story, Ms. Dell. I must, however,
I understand.
respectfully, I want to continue. Let you talk as long as
I'll be
you can,
grateful to answer any questions when you're ready.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Dell. Thank you very much. And now we will, next we'll hear from Celine Almazan. I hope I do justice with that name. So, Ms. Almazan, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Scott, Chairman Sablon, Ranking Member Fox, Ranking Member Owens, and members of the subcommittee. I am Celine Almazan, Legal Director for the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, COPA, and I am also a parent. 2 of my 3 children have disabilities and attended Maryland public schools. On behalf of COPA, I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. COPA is a national nonprofit organization of parents, attorneys, advocates, and related professionals who work to protect the civil rights and secure excellence in education on behalf of the 7.7 million children eligible for special education under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, and the 1.4 million students with disabilities protected by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. I want to start with what equity is and why it matters. Equity and equality are not the same. While equality means treating every student the same, equity means making sure that every student has the support they need to be successful. Equity in education requires putting systems in place to ensure that every child has an equal chance for success. Our education and disability laws are civil rights laws, and you can see my written testimony for a full discussion of each. The IDEA was enacted in 1975, and it is a civil rights and access law which governs how states and U.S. territories provide early intervention and special education to eligible children from birth to age 21. Section 504 prohibits discrimination and ensures equal access to an education for individuals with disabilities. The Americans with Disabilities Act is also critical to people and students with disabilities. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, promotes educational achievement and protects the interests of students disadvantaged by poverty, disability, ethnicity, race, and other conditions that may limit educational opportunity. A few data points provide understanding of who children with disabilities are and the status of state funding to educate them. Students with disabilities represent 14% of public school enrollment. 74% of fourth grade students with disabilities scored below basic in reading in 2019, compared with 29% of students without disabilities. Black students with disabilities represent 18% of students with disabilities, yet account for 35% of students with disabilities who are suspended or expelled from school. Congress has never come close to providing the IDEA funding promised to states, and states offset billions annually. Details are in my written testimony. The COVID-19 outbreak has placed a tremendous unprecedented strain on states, districts, educators, families, and students. In spring 2020, you and other congressional champions helped ensure that Congress did not provide states the ability to waive the requirements and protections of the IDEA. Thank you. This action, combined with guidance from the department reminding states and districts of their obligations to provide students with disabilities in education, helped steer several misguided districts and a handful of states back into compliance. We do not believe, however, that sufficient guidance has been provided on the issue of parents opting their children out of in-person schooling, as was done during the H1N1 virus. Students may be medically fragile, live with a loved one who is or have an intellectual disability that interferes with their ability to keep COVID-19 safety guidelines. No student should be deprived of IDEA services because the student's family or physician does not think it is safe to return to school. COPA formally asked the department to provide clarifying guidance last summer. This February, with 40 civil rights, disability, business, and educational organizations, COPA thanked the department for the decision to uphold the ESEA and require states to conduct statewide annual assessments. We said, data on multiple measures are essential are essential tools to address systemic inequities in our education system, as well as to gauge the quality of instruction and support offered under COVID-19 restrictions, end quote. To ensure equity and support of America's students, we make the following recommendations. Fully fund the IDEA and Title I of the ESEA and provide funds to help eliminate the shortages of counselors, social workers, nurses, school psychologists, and well-trained, fully certified special education teachers. Provide oversight so COVID-19 stimulus K-12 funding includes and will also address the learning loss of students with disabilities. Support the department to help states administer summative statewide assessments. Pass bills dedicated to improving school and climate and end the use of exclusionary discipline, including seclusion and restraint, such as the Keeping All Students Safe Act, and provide oversight to assure the department is equipped to enforce the equity in IDEA regulations. We must ensure that all students impacted by COVID-19 because of disability, race, ethnicity, foster care status, homelessness, and poverty are given resources to recover learning losses and ensure equity for all. I look forward to your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Almazan. And finally, we'll get to hear from Mr. Alberto M. Carvalho. Please, sir, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Sablin, Ranking Member Owens, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this important hearing. A special salutation to my dearly beloved Congresswoman Wilson. I'm proud to say that Miami-Dade is one of the highest performing urban school systems in the nation. We educate over 340,000 students each year, 93% of whom are minority and over 70% poor. However, our students regularly perform as well or better than their peers in nearly every academic measure and have achieved a graduation rate of over 93% during the pandemic. The recent unprecedented federal investments in education truly represent the potential to address long-term issues of academic equity in America. As our nation moves to reopen schools, and I believe strongly that schools should and can open safely with the proper protocols in place, great care must be taken to address the needs of our most fragile children, children who are impoverished, children of color, children who are English language learners, and children with disabilities. We must move quickly, swiftly, and courageously to address the learning loss that students have experienced because of the disruptions to instruction created by this pandemic. In our district, we have been transforming education and improving outcomes for all for well over a decade. And we did it by teaching and measuring what mattered and using the data to shine light into the dark gaps in places and drive improvement. We began with our youngest students creating high quality full-day pre-K programs, and then we looked to our secondary schools and found that opportunities were not always equal. So we ensured that rigorous course offerings were available at every high and middle school, including AP courses, dual enrollment, Cambridge, and opportunities for acceleration for all. We reinvigorated art, music, and world languages, career technical education, because all children have a right to an education that not only expands the mind, but also feeds the soul. We also implemented a tiered approach to providing schools the supports they need, particularly those in greatest need, driving resources and wraparound services in a differentiated way to our most fragile and struggling schools and students. Then finally, in 2012, we launched a digital initiative designed to integrate technology into all classrooms to unlock the potential of digital content, empowering students and teachers as never before with individualized instruction. In essence, we eliminated the digital divide. The result was a stunning improvement in graduation rates of over 30% and an elimination of F-rated schools in our district. All this work helped us prepare to rapidly respond to the unprecedented impact of COVID-19 in our schools. On March 13, 2020, in-person schooling came to a halt, and we quickly pivoted to an online learning model. We deployed 120,000 devices, more than 10,000 hotspots for connectivity, provided more than 30 professional development offerings to teachers to help support the transition to distance learning. Through constant communication and personal outreach to families, we achieved an impressive 93% average daily attendance rate during the school shutdown. When we returned for the start of the 2021 school year, we briefly did what other districts across the country did. We opened 100% online, but with a plan and an eye toward opening the schoolhouse as soon as it could be done safely. We assembled a task force of public health and medical experts, including U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy. We sought guidance and recommendations for safely returning to in-person school. Under their guidance and leadership provided by our own school board, all facilities were sanitized, ventilation systems were improved, personal protective equipment distributed to all employees. Schools were reconfigured with single directional hallways, social distancing in classrooms following the World Health Organization of 1 meter, which is 3 feet, 3 inches. A mandatory mask policy was implemented and medical personnel deployed to all schools. We also arranged for the distribution of infrared thermometers to all families, developed an employee health screening app, and launched a public-facing COVID-19 dashboard, successfully partnered with our various employee organizations, and agreed to protocols, workplace conditions, and accommodations. And on October 5th, 2020, Miami-Dade County Public Schools returned to in-person instruction 5 days a week at all schools for all students who wanted to return. We currently have about 50% of our students physically attending school, while the balance has chosen to remain online. This isn't a district where we value choice. 74% of our students attend non-traditional programs. As I close, we have found that we have been able to navigate reopening safely, and that all schools have actually been safer than the community at large in terms of viral transmission. Schools have always been and remain a safe haven for many who do not have a supportive home environment, who may be alone, who may be abused or neglected. We know there is work ahead to address the trauma and learning loss experienced by these children caught up in this crisis. The infusion of funding provided by the federal government is critical to meeting all these needs, but all involved must be diligent and responsible in the deployment of these dollars. These timely federal investments must be used in a manner that ensures improved academic achievement, operational efficiency, and fiscal responsibility.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Koval. I just breaks my heart that I have to interrupt all our witnesses who have great ideas and so, but I need to do so. We now turn to member questions. Under committee rule 9A, we will now recognize, we would question witnesses under the 5-minute rule also. I will be recognizing subcommittee members in seniority order. And again, to ensure that the members' 5-minute rule is adhered to, staff will be keeping track of time and a timer will sound when time has expired. Please be attentive to the time, wrap up when your time is over and remute your microphone. I will begin with myself, and as chairman, I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. On the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, and the American Rescue Plan collectively appropriated nearly $200 billion in grant aid to public K-12 schools across the country and allocated these funds by the Title I formula to ensure funds are targeted to where they are most needed. I know here in my district, in the far away in the Northern Marianas, where it is said that if I dig straight down, I would land up in Florida somewhere. But we were able to bring teachers were at reduced hours, 32 hours a week, but we were able now to bring them back to 40-hour weeks and start face-to-face instructions as well. But Superintendent Carvalho, why is it important that these funds from these two coronavirus aid packets, why is it important that these funds were allocated primarily to high poverty schools, like my district, for example?
Well, Mr. Chairman, for the reasons that you addressed, obviously, as believers in equitable practices, we recognize that not every child, not every school is facing the same challenges. And with varying levels of challenge, the funding needs to, in a differentiated way, be appropriated and delivered to directly support the needs of students and schools that face the greatest gaps. And in our district, a district that is over 90% minority, with a significant number of English language learners, where 11–12% of our children have one or more disability, we know where the need is. So the distribution of funding following a Title I methodology is appropriate because it begins with a recognition where the greatest need is. And in our district, obviously, we have earmarked and designated those dollars, and we have already spent 70% of the first ESSER allocation. We have designated and appropriated these dollars in what makes sense. Look, we know that addressing the health and safety of our students and workforce, addressing academic acceleration, simultaneously providing social and emotional support, all in non-recurring investments must be leaders in our consideration. You know, enhanced summer programming, extended day, week or year, after school tutorial programs, and the improvements to the physical facilities, which have deteriorated over time, particularly in the poorest areas and communities. So the HVAC system replacements, the sanitization upgrades to maintain good indoor air quality, all of those were necessary investments, and those investments must begin with the children of America who were in crisis before the COVID-19 crisis began.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Koval. Actually, you answered my second question as well. So I'm going to now turn to Ms. Almazan. Ms. Almazan, in light of the challenges students with disabilities face during the pandemic, it's enough that they face these challenges, many of these challenges, even pre-pandemic, and the additional funds provided by the American Recovery Rescue Plan. What are steps that schools can take now to ensure that all eligible students receive a free, appropriate public education, given the need for appropriate COVID-19 precautions?
Thank you for the question, Chairman Seblan. The issue of free appropriate public education for students with disabilities remains the requirement and a commitment that all school districts and states have to comply with. There have been no waivers during this time of the school closures. The question that's weighing heavily right now on many school districts and states is the idea of how we're going to make up for the learning loss that students suffered and the denial of a free appropriate public education because they did not get all of the services that are listed in their individualized education program, their IEP. During that time. And central to that, we do believe is the issue of end of the year assessments. With the leadership of the Urban League, we agree that the end of year assessments, particularly in reading and math, are going to inform the conversation of what kinds of compensatory education services students are going to need. Compensatory education is an equitable remedy, not to get too much into the weeds, but it's an equitable remedy that is formed by courts to place a child with a disability in the position that they would have been in, except for the denial, the educational loss, and not receiving all the services that they were supposed to receive, particularly during COVID-19.
Okay, Ms. I must cut you off. My time is up, but thank you for. I also once chaired the State Rehabilitation Advisory Council and have some idea of the IEPs for students particularly, but my son's a SPED teacher, so I do get firsthand experience. But thank you very much. I will now yield to the ranking member of the full committee, Dr. Fox, for 5 minutes of your question, please. Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Blunt, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being with us today. You've presented some interesting things I'd like to comment on later if I can. Ms. Dale, thank you for your testimony and thank you for fighting for Lizzie and all the children in Oregon. Your story is inspiring. One thing we've heard over and over again from teachers unions and others who have fought against families like yours to keep schools closed is that it simply isn't safe to reopen. Even the Biden administration CDC has said that reopening most schools to most students is unsafe. In your written testimony, you made reference to sharing research on safe reopening with state and local leaders. Do you believe that science indicates schools can reopen safely? And how did those states and local leaders respond to that science?
Thank you for your question, Dr. Fox. Since September, we've seen studies, and the groups that I've been a part of have worked really hard to review the different information from the CDC, from the WHO, from the American Academy of Pediatrics in helping to inform, whether or not it's safe to return. A lot of Emily Oster and a study out of North Carolina, several studies came out to indicate that there was a safe way to return to school. And we know that there's a safe way to do that by wearing masks and social distancing. And so those are the kinds of things that we have written to our local lawmakers and to decision makers here, like the Oregon Department of Education, to say, this is how other schools are safely reopening, and can we do this here in Oregon? But their response generally was, we've got to wait for case rates to come down, or we need to wait for the vaccine. And it felt like a lot of those goalposts sort of kept moving and kept moving and kept changing, even though we were able to see schools in other countries and schools in other locations open.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that you're in one of the most liberal states in the country, and all these people profess that they care about children. Everybody on this panel, all the witnesses care about children. They've been given billions of dollars, and yet they won't open the schools. It's the worst hypocrisy I've ever seen. Ms., you also said in your testimony you plan to have Lizzie repeat 3rd grade. And I heard what you said. She has to make a whole new set of friends. That's difficult for any child, any child. Can you tell us more about what led you to that decision, and if you think that decision would have been necessary if the schools had reopened when it was safe to do so?
It definitely wouldn't. We definitely wouldn't be having this conversation if the schools had reopened in September and Lizzie had been able to join her cohort of friends that she has built since actually since pre-kindergarten. And the reason that we're having to make that decision now is that you know, the online platform for schools is really a one size fits all. And I think some students have, you know, we've heard stories here in Oregon and elsewhere that some students have fared okay in that platform, but many haven't. And, you know, over 80% of the kids here want to go back to in-person learning, and their families want to get those kids back to in-person learning. For Lizzie, I spent mornings with my arms literally wrapped around her stomach, trying to keep her in front of a screen. And there was a teacher, an aide, and a learning specialist on the other side of the screen, trying to help Lizzie with counting and with writing and reading. And it was a platform that was impossible. And so we could either choose to spend our mornings in tears for 2.5 hours trying to learn over that platform, you know, with a child who didn't understand why her teacher had her muted or why the other kids wouldn't wave to her and say hello, or we could, we just didn't have a choice. I mean, we couldn't just keep her staying, you know, involved and engaged in that platform. And I think that was, for us, what felt very overlooked in the guidance that was released about learning online is that children with cognitive disabilities, you know, they're motivated by their peers, they're assisted by their peers in learning. And when that isn't there online, their learning just doesn't happen. And so she has 7 months of no general education.
I think you have a great civil rights case on your hands based on the legislation of IDEA, based on the comments one of the other witnesses said.
Thank you, Dr.
Mr.
Fox.
Sablon. Thank you so much, Ms. Dale, for being such a great role model.
Right, Ms. Dale, thank you.
Thank you, I'm honored.
Some of your statements are personal experiences that are just incredible. I hope Oregon does eventually open up so I could come and visit my grand and my great grandkids also. So thank you. Next, I'd like to recognize Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth, you have 5 minutes, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the witnesses for their contributions today. I want to start by referencing something Mr. Owens said in his opening statement. And Mr. Owens, I want to let you know that I was a New York Jets fan when you were playing for them. I was also a registered Republican at the time, so I'm not sure what that says about either the Jets or the party. But I'm really concerned about this notion that the Democrats are somehow unconcerned about IDEA and the students that are served through that program. You know, I'm both President Biden and I know Speaker Pelosi and many others have said, show me your budget and I'll understand your values. And I think that's very true. And in the American Rescue Plan, we committed $3 billion to IDEA, along with $130 billion for education overall, much of which can be used to support students with disabilities as well. So I think it's kind of disingenuous to question Democrats' commitment to IDEA when every Republican voted against
Yes.
that proposal, and not only voted against it, but I don't remember, and I was present for most of the debates, never one time saying that any portion of the American Rescue Plan was worth supporting. So, you know, I'm certainly, I think we always ought to oversee in Congress any of the programs that we mandate. So I'm not necessarily saying we shouldn't, again, take care that our money is being spent wisely and effectively. But again, the hypocrisy here is pretty astounding. And I also have to take issue with this weaponization of the idea of opening the schools. And I've heard it day after day after day for the last couple of months. The Republicans want states and localities to have control over things when it serves their political purposes. But when it doesn't, then all of a sudden they want the government to mandate that they open. I was in a conversation last week with the superintendent of the Fleming County, Kentucky school system. Fleming County, Kentucky is in the eastern part of the state, not in my district. It voted for Donald Trump 78-21. So it's certainly not a blue area. Their school system has 2,200 students. The superintendent, they opened school partially, I shouldn't say partially, on a voluntary basis last September. So before there was any real CDC guidance on what was safe and what wasn't safe. They're still open now. About half of their students system-wide are actually attending in person. Those parents, those families made their decisions, which I always thought was what Republicans thought was the appropriate thing to do. This is a very complicated situation. We're all very much in uncharted territory and have been for a year now. So I really resent all of this politicization of the notion that, once again, now, because Democrats are in charge, we ought to make everybody open schools. Or even when Donald Trump was in charge, that we ought to open all schools. I don't think that's the way this country works and our families work. I do have one question I want to ask of Superintendent Carvalho. I don't know how much your school system is going to get, but I know based on what my school system is going to get, it's a lot of money. And one of the things that we were criticized for throughout this debate was a very small percentage of this money is going to be spent this year meaning over the next 6 months. As you contemplate using the funding that we provided through the American Rescue Plan to Miami-Dade schools, where do you perceive the need being today versus next year and the year after, and things that you may do with that money during that period of time?
Yes, I have 39 seconds for that, Mr. Carvalho.
I'll be very quickly. Thank you very much for the question. Certainly, look, we're going to bucket into 3 areas. Number one, continue to improve the environment of schools, sanitization, additional equipment, indoor quality improvements, capital projects. Secondly, acceleration strategies to ensure that those who fell behind are able to catch up not only to where they were prior to the crisis, but actually to their place where they should be in accordance with their chronological age and grade level. This is not only about taking them to where they were prior to the COVID crisis, and that's going to require massive amounts of investment in before, after school programming, year-round schooling, summer schooling, before and after programming, individual tutorial programs, and individualized digital content to support them pedagogically as well as socially and emotionally. That's where the brunt of the investment is going to go.
Thank
So
you.
by
Thank you.
definition, that has to be done over time.
It will take some time. This is not going to necessarily be a sprint, but at the same time, the more we wait, the more children will fall behind. So we'll be very swift based on the plans that we already have in place.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
thank you. And
Thank you.
if it weren't for Mr. Yarmoff, if it weren't for your work in the American Rescue Plan, my schools would not be open for phase instructions, and my teachers will still be going on 32 hours a week paid.
Thank you.
So thank you. Thank you. And at this time, I recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Owens. I had no
Thank
idea
you.
you were a professional football player.
Thank you so much. Well, and I'll say that for those still rooting for the Jets, I tip my hat, and I'm sorry to hear the misery you've gone through the last few years. Anyway, that being said, let me just say this. We just spent another $130 billion on this last bill. We already had money in there before to make sure that our schools open. We had not been spent. So I think the question comes down to, as we look at states like Utah, we opened it pretty quickly. We gave the power to we the people to decide how we wanted to make sure that businesses open up, schools opens. So not only we're one of the leaders in this country in terms of our economy coming back, but I'm talking with kids in their schools every single day. And the problem is this: across our country, parents are the same and our children are the same. We want to make sure that our kids are moving forward. So yes, we're right. We have to deal with the fact that there are different ways of approaching this. It appears that the democratic states are the ones that are shutting things down. We have issues like this where our kids are literally, and those that are hurt the most are those that are at risk, those that are poor, and those are the ones that we are now fighting for. It should never be a process in which across our country we have such a disparity in terms of how we're dealing with something that is common between all of us. So that being said, I want to say, first of all, to Mrs. Dale, thank you so much. There's no stronger advocates for children than their parents. And you truly are showing America what that looks like. We don't sit back and wait for others. We roll up our sleeves and go to work. And thank you so much. You're old school parents, and there's a lot of parents across this country trying to figure out how they can do the same. So you're a great example for us. Ms. Dale, again, thanks for sharing your story. A ranking member of Fox asked what was learned about risk of reopening schools. We know that from the science that reopening schools is safe. We also know that it's not 100% risk-free. Nothing in life is. What would you say? Why would you say that whatever risk exists in sending your daughter back to school was worth it? Or do you think that every risk that it was well worth it to have to take some risk to make that happen?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Ranking Member Owens. It's a true honor to be able to advocate for my daughter in this manner and in this way, because I feel like, she doesn't have a voice always. And the risks, there's always a trade-off. There's always some costs and benefits to the things that we do. My daughter with Down syndrome, I think you might know this. If you have a cognitive disability or developmental disability, you're generally in the 1A group, for example, of side effects. And if you get COVID-19, it does hit harder and it is more severe. But the other side of that is having a disability, whether it's physical, whether it's a cognitive disability, it can be very isolating. It can be very lonely. And for us, the trade-off was, we saw her here at home, very lonely, very isolated, not learning, not able to get onto a Google Classroom and see friends and see peers each day. And that's just no way to live. There's no way to live a day or a year or a week or anything like that. And so what we really did is we went to work with the school and said, we know that masking and we know that distancing work, and can you work with us to at least give her a couple of hours of in-person education? We can do some worksheets. We worked really hard with the school to find some way of getting those doors back open. In fact, she was the first person in her school district to return to school. And the trade-off for us was just that living as isolated and as lonely as that was just never going to be sustainable for our daughter and for our family. It's very sad.
Well, again, we're being raised by teachers, myself, I understand. And let me just say this: your concerns you have, what you're going through, has absolutely nothing to do with Medicare for all, defunding the police, wealth and millionaire taxes, $500 billion in schools statewide, nationwide, housing security, and a charter school moratorium. And these are the things that are being demanded by our teachers union so that young people, children like yours, can actually go back to school. It should never, ever come to that point where we've been held hostage for these type of things that has nothing to do with our kids growing up and experiencing the American dream and their future. So I want to thank you for that. I won't have time for another question, so I'm going to yield back. But thank you for everything you're doing. Really, really proud of your efforts, for sure.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Owens. Next, I'd like to recognize Ms. Wilson. Ms. Wilson, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, Federica.
I just have to say to everyone, just be aware that we are in the middle of a pandemic. This is a health emergency that no one could ever predict. And the one group of people who kept our children afloat were our teachers, because all schools had to shut down. And I've seen so many parents who have said to me, now I respect the job of a teacher, and I will never again vote or try to advocate for anything but a raise for teachers, because they kept the boat afloat. So this whole pandemic has caused us to be able to peel back the layers, I would say, on an onion. And we see so much disparities as we peel back the onion. I had one little boy say to me, I said, I need you to take a picture for the newspaper, but I want you to sit at a desk, sit at a table in a chair with a blank wall. He said, Ms. Wilson, we don't have a table. I said, you don't have a table in the whole house? Where do you eat? He said, we eat at the kitchen counter in shifts. So I want to say that the money that was sent to the school districts, not only do we need to worry about what our superintendents are doing to make our schools safe, which is what they have done. My school superintendent has done it. My neighboring school superintendents have done it. Mr. Scott and I held briefings with teachers in Miami-Dade, Broward, and Alabama. And the disparities that we saw between those school districts in Broward and Dade, I can say I'm proud in Alabama. So not only do we need, I want school districts across the nation, including the 2 that I represent, to commit to using the Title I formulated money to give every Title I children a computer, a desk, and a chair to take home in their homes, because homework will not disappear and broadband access will not disappear. And just having a quiet place to do your homework and everything else is so important. And I'm sure our superintendent and our parents and everyone else on this call agrees. I just want to say tutoring. And we have all agreed, and our superintendent Cavallo has said that summer school, we have the summer slide, we have the COVID slide, the COVID-19 slide, and now the children just call it the 19. So that slide, we have to close that achievement gap that has exacerbated what we have seen for generations. And all of the money that our Democrats put in a bill that was not supported by one Republican, and my school district got $1 billion, we expect to see a huge change. And everyone, not only teachers and school districts, but the community has to work together to pull these children up. I want to say that I heard Mr. Mariel is, how can these short-term resources be used to create the long-term systemic changes necessary to provide all students with equitable access to an excellent education? You talked about it in your remarks. Help us.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. And we've got to understand that Congress is to be commended for appropriating the additional money. But one of the equity issues that American schools face has been a severe resource gap. Differential investments in schools within a school district, differential investments within schools from county to county or district to district in a given state. I think that each school district, and the Miami superintendent outlined his thought process, has to intelligently deploy this additional money. around proven strategies, evidence-based strategies. It may be reading coaches. It may be accelerated learning in the summertime. It may be to provide every child with a Chromebook so that they can go home and even if they're in class, they're going to be doing homework. To provide those students with the resources that they need to be able to play catch up. We're going to be playing catch up. What I do hope is that this investment will demonstrate why closing the resource gap amongst American public schools has to be the work not only of the Congress, but of the states and of local school districts, because that's
Thank
one of the
you.
fundamental issues that we face.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Wilson. Thank you very much. Look, there was just an education summit just yesterday, I think, and there is no disagreement among everyone that we need to get schools open. But there was also no disagreement among all the participants that we have to do it in a safe manner, that we're still reaching out in the dark on this pandemic, and it's dangerous because somebody could infect somebody, and you know, we're talking here about not just health, but we're talking about lives, and so we need to do this in a safe manner. And there's no disagreement. Just like we all want to go back into the committee room, we all want our children, our school students back to school. Some may do it faster, more quicker. Some may take a little bit of time. We will get there. It takes work, and of course, it takes the resources that we just appropriated that like nobody on the other side of the aisle supported. But thank you. I now would recognize Mr. Grothman. Please, sir. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Okay, well, we can get to 3 quick questions here. First question, I am asked in my area. There's several private schools, maybe Catholic schools, Christian schools, Lutheran schools, what have you. They almost all seem to be open, and at least some of the larger public schools are closed. Can anybody give me, any one of the 4 of you, give me a reason as to why it seems that the private schools seem to stay open and disproportionately the public schools closed? Does anybody want to take a shot at that?
Well,
Mr. Real?
through the chairman, I can tell as superintendent of the 4th largest school system in America, we have had 100% of our schools open on a basis of parental choice since early October. I can tell you that about 50% of the students in Miami-Dade attend school in a physical way. I can tell you also that we were very diligent in establishing all the protocols and the mitigating strategies and the policies established by the board for the safe return of the students. And we were also diligent in the appropriate conversations with a labor organization for the protocols.
Yep, I know you were. The question is, why were others not open?
Well, I can tell you that we lived through a time of high positivity rate in Miami-Dade. I think our instructional continuity plan and level of preparedness put us in a position of following science, and the science to us put us in a position of being able to open schools.
I can comment too, as Congressman Grothman, that I had to switch 2 of my children to private schools. So my daughter Lizzie with a disability remains in public school, and she's getting the fewest instructional hours out of any of my 3 children being in public school. And my 2 children who have moved over to private school are now in full-time, in person. And the challenge that we're facing right now with my daughter Lizzie receiving services is that there's in the contract for the teachers to come back to work is a work from home condition that has been they've been unable to renegotiate. So I think that's been one of the biggest problems in our area.
Thank you. It kind of surprised me because I think the public schools usually have more money, but it's a little bit surprising. Next question I have, I was looking at some of the money going out to Milwaukee, and our poorer district, Milwaukee is getting funding 63% of their normal budget is coming in from the feds, whereas it looks like your average school district around Wisconsin, 10, 15%, not even as much. I realize there's a feeling out there that we have to give more money to the school districts with more kids in poverty. And of course, Milwaukee and Wisconsin already starts by spending more money than the average district because, you know, we drain money across the more middle class districts to flood it in Milwaukee. But 63% compared to like 7%, 10% with the other schools. Does that sound to you as a little excessive a difference? Are we going overboard in flooding money at the more Title I districts?
Let me ask, no, not at all, because the money is needed because of systemic inequities. When you talk about what do children need should be the guide. And many of our urban school districts have been underfunded, and because they are in urban areas.
Mr. I hate to cut you off. Like I
No,
said, right
please,
now, Wisconsin,
please don't.
Milwaukee already is over. So,
Please don't cut me off.
okay.
Please don't cut me off. You ask me a question, I want to answer the question. And so my point is that it's more than justified. The Title I formula was established in the 1960s, and the additional funding that Congress appropriated followed the Title I formula, which is based on need.
Okay, thank you. Final question. I noticed when you talk about your school districts, not just you, but everybody, we seem to talk about race or we talk about poverty. And I sometimes think family structure maybe is more important than those. Can you tell me why when the education establishment lays out what type of students we have, we focus on people's ancestry, you know, 8 or 9 generations ago, or we focus on money, but we don't focus around family structure? Would it be helpful if we also collected those statistics? Maybe I'll ask the guy from Miami-Dade that question.
Thank you. The guy from Miami-Dade is ready. Sir, I think that number one, a lot of the gaps, academic gaps that we deal with are preceded by all sorts of social gaps, whether it's home insecurity, family instability, a lack of adequate access to food or home. In Miami-Dade, I can tell you that we take into account all the elements that influence a child. That is why we developed a parent academy, which is in essence a college to support parents become an echo of education for their children. We intensified that parent academy during the pandemic to really assist parents in providing ideal educational environments in their homes during the school closure, ensuring that the parents had better knowledge of the devices and the digital content that their students were utilizing. So it's not an either or, it's a recognition of all of the social gaps, the financial gaps that children fall into before they arrive at the schoolhouse. With that said,
do you collect those other statistics even? Do you even collect the other statistics?
I'm sorry?
To see how well you're doing, do you collect the statistics by family background?
Certainly, for me, it's actually more important the statistics that others collect. So I wear 2 hats. I'm superintendent of Miami-Dade, but I'm also a member of the National Assessment of Educational Progress Board. And Miami-Dade's 4th graders, despite the level of poverty, despite the English language limitation, and despite the 11% that have one or more disability, according to the NAEP, the last administration of NAEP, in reading and mathematics, NAEP TUDA, they are number 1 in the country, 4th grade reading and mathematics. So schools with the appropriate supports through the diligence of leadership, data-driven strategies, and the incredible powerful work of teachers and visionary policy on the parts of the board can in fact overcome some of those issues.
I love the back and forth, but I must interject and recognize Mr. Desaunier next. Mr. Desaunier, you have 5 minutes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Ruffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. Just a comment on the previous questions from the gentleman in Wisconsin. In relation to my district here in the San Francisco Bay Area, that used to be the former chair of this committee, Congressman Miller, who was in the Congress for 40 years. Our district has some of the wealthiest districts, my district now, in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. And we have some of the poorest and some in between. And we've been working along with the current superintendent of public instruction in California and the previous one, both of whom came from this district, to try to deal with this disparity, we worked very closely with Governor Brown when he did the local control formula that helped California move even more money under Title I, well, consistent with Title I. So the disparity in the family structure, we know the history across this country, and you've talked about it. And just frustrating to hear these conversations. We've been studying this for decades. The pressure in my district on a single woman of color who's got kids prior to COVID and the inequality in this country was already astronomical. So as the panelists has talked to and others, sort of shocking that we'd even talk about this now. We know where the challenge is, and we know the benefit not just for that community that historically has been treated so poorly by this country, in my view, but also the benefit to all of us if we invest in that community. And I'm very proud of the legislation that Congressman Thompson and I did on family engagement centers a couple sessions ago. So sorry for that editorial comment. My question for the panel is, you've got all of this that I just alluded to prior to COVID, and COVID, of course, had a disproportionate impact on these districts and the students. It strikes me that there's both a challenge and an opportunity. We already knew that single parent households in poor communities and communities of color were very heavily challenged to get their kids to school, to get them in school, to give them support after school, and all those wraparound services we've worked so hard for. And then you've got COVID, where Chairman Scott has talked about 40% of the school districts in this country, schools in this country, don't have heating and air conditioning. So we've got to go back in and provide that infrastructure for future public health. So in that context, maybe you could respond, starting with the superintendent in Miami, the challenges and opportunities of coming out of COVID, particularly for this affected community.
Thank you so much for the question. I'll try to be very brief. I think you touched on a very important point, and made me reflect on the previous questions as well. Look, I think the strategy to accelerate students, particularly students who fall into those gaps that you described, to accelerate them to their full potential, we cannot simply restore their performance to what it was prior to the COVID crisis. And we simultaneously cannot allow these investments, which are so sorely needed, we cannot allow this to be looked upon as a time for opportunism, rather a time of opportunity, a time when we have an opportunity to, as a nation, provide solutions to long-term resource disparity and strategically invest in academic equity. And for me, whether we're talking about the Black, Latino communities, impoverished communities, students with disabilities, for me, that requires strategic investment resources that follows the condition of the child in the school. Otherwise, we will never reach equal results, because the process of equity requires differentiated resource investment depending on the condition. Secondly, it requires family engagement, support for the communities, requires additional time on task by the best teachers around us. That means summer sessions, spring break. We're going on spring break this coming week. There will be about 80 schools in Miami that will be holding session. For some students, social emotional support, pedagogical educational support throughout the summer, but also with arts and music access, so they benefit from the experience. And lastly, and this is still an issue across the country, many places, the digital divide still keeps a lot of students, a lot of communities, a lot of parents to education that is bell to bell. After the last bell, there is a total level of disengagement. That is why we rushed to address the issue of eliminating the digital deserts, for that condition to be eliminated. And our students can continue to learn after the last bell. And if the computer is at home with connectivity, we can simultaneously address the needs, the long-term needs of parents.
Just, Mr. Chairman, one last observation.
Okay, make it quick.
Okay, one of the wealthiest school districts in my district, a third of their funding comes from the foundation, so the parents. So just this dichotomy, want to re-emphasize. Sorry to take so long, Mr. Chairman, and nothing against the parents who have money contributing, but it demonstrates to me the challenge here in the dichotomy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, no, thank you. And Mr. Carvalho, if you ever have a need for a job, a school commissioner in my district, no wonder Miss Wilson's so proud of you, sir. Thank you. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Allen, please, for 5 minutes, Mr. Allen.
Thank you, Chairman, and
Thank you.
thank you to all of those who are
Hi,
here
Rick.
today. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, great.
I'm just happy to see you again.
Yes, happy to see you. Evidently, I got booted out of the ranking member on this committee, but somehow I got on another one, so I miss you.
Yes, sir.
But K through 12 is very special to my heart, and it's been a difficult year. Obviously, I pushed my district to reopen schools as well as pretty much the entire state of Georgia, except maybe at Metro Atlanta. But we are open. I have 14 grandchildren, and we have a special needs grandchild. She cannot walk, she cannot talk, she cannot sit up, she cannot feed herself, and she's 4 years old. But when I'm around, she wants to come to me, and she sits in my lap or hugs my neck and just smiles at me. She is absolutely the most precious grandchild that God could have given me, and I'm just tickled to death. And she's been in school off and on. They've had kids with COVID, and she's had to come home, and then she's had to go back. And one time she was actually apparently very close to one of the children that had COVID, or an adult, and I guess it was maybe one of the staff. And she's never had it, so I guess she's asymptomatic. I don't know, but it's just amazing. She's an amazing child. But obviously, it's been difficult, and I want to say thank you to all of our educators who, I mean, you know, there were two ways to go with this thing. We could either surrender or we could fight. And you know, at least the educators that I know very closely, and what I've heard here is testimony today. Y'all are fighting. You're in harm's way. You're doing it for the kids. We have people in the food business that do that. People in the healthcare business have done that. A lot of Americans have stepped up and kept this thing going through unprecedented time. Ms. Dell, your story is amazing, and you described that you went public with your concerns and what you heard from other parents, especially those having children with needs similar to your daughters. Can you describe why you went public with that?
Yeah, I don't think I had a choice. I think that my daughter Lizzie, you know, she wasn't going to learn at all this year unless we did something, unless we said something to the district and to our state leaders that what was going on. And I think that as you might know, during COVID, all of us parents felt like what was going on in our homes was so private, and none of us wanted to fail. And so none of us said anything until sort of looking around and saying, wait, that's happening with you too, or you're having a hard time too. And so as soon as one person spoke up and said this was difficult for me, it enabled a lot of other parents to speak up and say, I'm having a really hard time with my kids too. And it's kind of embarrassing. It's a feeling of failure. And but then other families trying to get the resources for their kids, we get specially designed instruction for my daughter, and that wasn't something that was being offered. And so while some families like ours chose to really fight and come to the table and figure out a way to get some of those services delivered, other families had to give up. And a lot of families have had to unenroll from school because those services weren't being offered or delivered or provided to them.
Yes. Well, let me tell you, this is where our founders gave us a grassroots country. They gave Americans the opportunity in the First Amendment to voice our concerns when we see them. And this country will always be a grassroots country. Special interest tries to rule, but I'm telling you, the people and the grassroots efforts are what get things done. Thank you for bringing attention to this. And I know it takes a lot of courage to do that because you probably got criticized along the way.
Mm-hmm. In fact, I was on a couple of radio stations and tried to share our story. And I'll never forget one parent posting this so publicly saying, "Oh, that mom just wants her most difficult child out of the house."
Right.
And I think that was the moment that I thought, no, actually, I just want my children to get an education. It was harder for us to get an education.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
it's been tough, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Let me see. All right. Let me go now on Mr. Morelli.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. No, thank you for your patience, sir.
Yeah, well, thank you. This is a very, very important hearing, and I think there's no question that all of us, I think, recognize the importance of having children physically back in school where we can. And I think that's what we're all working very hard to do, recognizing, however, that we want to do it appropriately. I had sort of two different questions that occurred to me during this conversation. I appreciate very much the witnesses and them being here today and lending their expertise. The first is around the question of children with different abilities. We've talked a fair amount, as Ms. Dale has pointed out, and I thank her very much for sharing her story, that children with different abilities are more vulnerable to the virus, maybe among the most hesitant to take the risk of returning to school. But I wonder if the educators could talk about measures they have taken in the schools that are open to keep school students with disabilities from falling behind. Well, I guess, first of all, for those who are unable to be in the classroom, what steps have you taken to ensure that children with different abilities can still get a quality education? Could we have some comments perhaps from the superintendent in Miami-Dade about, for those students who weren't physically in the classroom, what they've done and what their experience has been?
Certainly. Thank you very much for the question and through the chair. Number one, about 52% of students with special abilities are currently enrolled physically in our schools. So they're attending physical classroom. Over the past two grading periods, the first 2 quarters, we identified additional students that we believed should be in the classroom rather than at home. And we've had conversations with their parents. Despite their choice of modality, we felt it would be in the best interest of the child to actually return to school for a more direct intervention with them. But for those, specific to your question, for those whose parents decided to keep them at home, we've taken a number of actions. Number one, we ensured that all these students with disabilities had access to curriculum through the provision of assistive technology that goes above and beyond what's typically provided for students, adaptive accommodations, specialized supplementary curricular resources. We developed a distance learning implementation plan for each student with disability, describing how their IEP would be implemented during distance learning. We provided ongoing professional development for teachers and paraprofessionals for this new adaptation, and as appropriate, the necessary therapies entitled to this child via their IEP. We conducted the traditional IEP meetings with psychoeducational evaluations continued virtually throughout the closure, so that students who required specialized services and supports could be not only identified, but actually receive these supports. Lastly, we supported the families. We established hotlines in addition to webinars for parents to be aware of their rights and how to best maximize online resources and the adaptive technologies. But again, I'd like to close by saying there is, for a child with disability who requires hands-on intervention, a paraprofessional, one-on-one, there is no substitute for the experience that our teachers provide them in school. That is why we keep urging those parents to actually return children to the schoolhouse.
Yeah. Well, look, I thank you very much. And it occurs to me, Mr. Chair, perhaps we ought to be thinking about best practices and protocols for those instances where children with disabilities are not able to be physically in the classroom. And I have just a minute left, but one of the other things that I'm very interested in is the pandemic has given us certain learnings, one around telehealth and telemedicine and the greater use of technology. Obviously, distance learning has had its challenges. in terms of the deployment of broadband, both in rural communities, urban communities. So I'm troubled by that and how we need to work together to be able to make sure that deployment is greater in the future, not only for increasing the opportunities for children in pandemics, but I think even for enrichment opportunities where additional online content might be available, but it's just not simply available to certain children in certain communities. And I wondered if people could just, and I apologize because I'm down to 20 seconds, so it's going to be really short answers. The feds will continue to add resources. We have done that in December in our latest American Rescue Plan. Are there ways for communities to sustain it with what will be limited federal resource in the future, and how much of a priority will you put it in the local districts? And I'd ask any of the, perhaps Mr. Morial at the Urban League might have a comment.
Yeah, or
and I'm over time. I apologize.
Time up.
Maybe I'll take
Okay.
that.
maybe someone would. It's a good question. Maybe someone will yield you time, if I may.
I appreciate it. I yield back, Mr. Chair. Thank
yeah.
you.
Thank you. So I now recognize Mrs. Miller of Illinois. Mrs. Miller, going once, going twice. All right, Mr. Cawthorn. Sir, you have 5 minutes. Mr. Cawthorn, going once, going twice. I know he's online, but I guess he's stepped away. Let me see. Mr. Mr. Keller, I apologize. Mr. Keller, you've been very patient. Sir, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Republicans and Democrats should be united in working to safely reopen our schools. As we've witnessed, and I've brought to the attention several times before the committee, most recently during remote hearings, if in the United States Congress, when we're at the Capitol, and we cannot get the technology right with all the resources we have right at our disposal and a staff, quite frankly, how can we expect our students to participate in virtual learning? Virtual learning has played an important part while we reopen our schools, but not just in parts of north central and northeastern Pennsylvania and in other rural areas around our country, but also in urban areas all across the United States. Virtual learning is not always as reliable as we've witnessed with the issues we've seen even in the capital city, Washington, D.C. Every student learns differently, and we cannot rob an entire generation of students the choices they need to pursue an education. For instance, the CDC has warned that the absence of in-person education options may disadvantage certain students with disabilities. The continually changing nature of COVID-19 guidelines makes it that much more challenging for school districts, school administrators, schools, teachers, parents, and students. The evidence is clear. Students should be allowed back in the classroom and be permitted to attend school in a safe manner. Ms. Dale, I thank you for being here today and for sharing your experience and your story. I can only imagine what it has been like having school-aged children during this pandemic and seeing them lose out on critical in-person learning. I wish nothing but the best for Lizzie and the rest of your family and everybody as we continue to reopen our schools. Your story underscores the importance of having choices for students during the current pandemic and going forward. How would your experience have been different if there had been more flexibility for in-person learning during these tight reopening restrictions, like in Lake Oswego, Oregon?
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Congressman Keller. I have some choices for my other two children and none for my daughter, Lizzie. And like I mentioned before, the instructional hours that she is receiving are far less in public school than the instructional hours that are being received by my two other kids in private school now. And we're really fortunate to have the resources to put our other children in private school. But what we'd really like to be able to do is have those choices for all three of our kids. And I'm on calls frequently with children with families in East County, Portland, where these are all Title I schools, or in schools where kids have much fewer choices than the kids in our school district. And this summer they're talking about grants and funding that's coming to the school districts for summer school and summer programs. And I guess I'm really grateful that there's some additional funds being allocated. But my question is that actually going to go to my daughter, or is that going to actually go to any of these kids who really need those funds and that education and those extra supports? Because so far they're not opening and they're not offering any of those programs to my kids or to other kids in our area. And so I think my biggest concern, I'm really grateful that I hear that more money is being allocated. But to date, to get any of these services for our kids has been a real fight, has been a real uphill battle to, like Lizzie still hasn't had a full year of no occupational therapy, no speech therapy, no physical therapy. All of it's delivered via telehealth. And as I think other witnesses have said, telehealth doesn't work for some kids with cognitive disabilities. And so I guess my question is if we continue to allocate funds, is that going to go to my child or these needy children in some of these districts? Where is it going to go?
That's actually a really good question, because last year, Congress provided more than 70 billion to schools. And, when we look at the cost that has been put out there, it's been estimated for implementation, it'd be $442 $442 per student on the high end. And that would amount to about 25 billion. So we've appropriated more than almost 3 times what the estimate is. So I'm just hopeful that the money will get to where it was designed to go, so that kids like Lizzie can have the help they need to thrive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Keller. Thank you very much. I now recognize Ms. Macbeth, Lucy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to say thank you to all of our witnesses today for your excellent testimony and you're such grounded in this issue. And Ms. Dale, I just want to say I applaud you for such loving care and commitment towards Lizzie and your children. And I'm so sorry that remark was made towards you, because it's so apparent that you truly have done everything that you can to make sure that Lizzie has the care and resources that she needs for her education. I do want to say that this month, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan into law, giving schools across the country the funding and the resources that they so desperately need to make it through the COVID-19 pandemic. And the American Rescue Plan includes the biggest, as we've said, it includes the biggest investment in the United States K-12 education ever in history. And in fact, the 3 school districts that are part of my congressional district here in Georgia will be receiving about $676 million from this vital legislation. I couldn't be more happy for my district. This funding actually goes towards helping schools reopen safely and equitably, addressing learning loss to all of our students, and helps our students to get back on track to achieving their post-secondary goals. 80% of the good paying jobs that now require a post-secondary education, and unfortunately COVID-19 is wreaking havoc on college enrollment rates. And this fall, the percentage of high school graduates who went on to college immediately after high school fell by 22%. So the decline in enrollment was nearly twice as large for low-income high school graduates than for their higher income peers. And though there's always been a disconnect between high school and college, more students than ever we know are falling through the cracks because of this pandemic. Mr. Carvalho, what should we be doing in the short term and in the long term to support students in making the transition from high school to post-secondary education? And how can funding from the American Rescue Plan Act be used to help them?
Thank you very much for the question, Congresswoman. That is probably one of the most important questions that I've heard today, because it deals with the fact that 12th grade does not represent finality in the educational opportunity or journey of students. And we know that many students who graduate high school don't necessarily have a road towards a post-secondary viable placement. So what can be done with these funds, quite frankly, and I alluded to it during my early prepared remarks, is number one, the identification of those students, particularly at the secondary level, who are about to graduate, but may not necessarily have the number of credits. There are opportunities for credit recovery during the summer. Secondly, there are opportunities during the summer and the rest of this school year to engage students in career technical programming that is economically linked to the communities they live in. Thirdly, there are opportunities to engage students in more actively participating in ACT and SAT preparatory programs that students in more affluent communities take for granted, giving them an additional chance at having access to those programs and those exams. There are also opportunities that can be created during the spring break, the rest of the school year, and during the summer to go above and beyond the minimum requirements that the standards in any one state require, preparing these students for success, whether it's college, a two-year technical school, college, or university. In Miami-Dade, I can tell you that we pay close attention to the post-secondary goals and level of preparedness of our students. We make the appropriate investments. We plan with the ARP dollars, with these recovery investments, supplement our career technical programming, supplement our SAT and ACT preparation, supplement over the weeks and months that we have the additional credit recovery for students, and also provide a repertoire of opportunities for these students, particularly those who are in high school right now, to really solidify their proficiency level in areas that will enable them to be successful in their post-secondary endeavors.
Thank you so much for that question. I'm so sorry. This is my dog in the background. And Ms. Almazan, over the summer and in the fall, I spoke with teachers in my district about their experiences with virtual learning. And many of them were very, very worried that their students, especially those with disabilities, and we're talking about these very students today, that they were going to fall behind because of the lack of in-person attention, as Ms. Dale has just been so eloquently speaking about today, and that they were able that they weren't able to get this kind of in-person learning through the virtual learning. What steps has Secretary Cardona taken to reach out to the disability community and ensure that disabled students are a priority when schools are considering reopening and these decisions?
Well, Secretary Cardona reached out to us within the first week of him being confirmed, and he has been very open to the issues because he came from Connecticut, and he certainly understands the issues that diverse learners and equity present and challenge. I want to say that there are a variety of places that have addressed the issues of remote learning, places like Center for Learner Equity, Educating All Learners Alliance, COPA is a partner, the National Center for Learning Disabilities. They all have resources and have created resources in the last year. And we look forward to working with Secretary Cardona as we try to address the needs of students with disabilities.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Macbeth. Thank you. I now like to recognize again, try Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Miller. Mr. Cawthorn. Mr. Cawthorn. Mrs. Steele.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, I apologize for that, sir.
Okay, Mr. Cawthorn, right?
Yes, sir. How are you doing?
We're good. You have 5 minutes.
That's good to hear. So Ms. Dale, I sincerely appreciated your sentiments talking about your desire to open some of the schools and everything you were facing. I've got a disability myself, not necessarily a mental one, but a physical one. So I feel for your child who's having to go through this. Can I ask you, what is it like, the world like for your daughter now, really after going through a full year of her being just alone and secluded from her friends within school?
Thank you, Representative Cawthorn. We're reestablishing routines now. We're trying to figure out where the gaps are, where the gaps exist, how to return some of that structure. We've actually hired a behavior specialist to come to our house and work with us a couple of hours a week, because what happens when a child with a disability attends school is they get into a flow of structure and routine. They're with peers and they use that peer modeling to learn. And when that routine is disrupted or changed, they lose a lot of those. They lose a lot of that structure. They lose a lot of that routine that really helps a child with a disability, know how to navigate their day. I think the other challenge that we're trying to overcome right now is just there's still no physical education being provided in our schools. So while our schools have started to reopen in a hybrid format, there's no recess and there's no PE. And that's something that, kids in club sports and kids in private, I've got a daughter that's on a private dance team, children that have access to club activities like that a lot of students, either vulnerable students of, low income or students with disabilities like my daughter Lizzie, don't have access to things like club sports. Schools are a place that they get to have physical education. And so we're dealing with not just academic losses and friendships and other losses, but we're dealing with, physical challenges and things like, eating the right healthy foods and getting the right level of physical activity.
Right. Well, Jennifer, thank you very much for taking your time to be able to speak with all of us. I do want to ask one more question. Do you think that some of the federal Department of Education's funding, to these states and other areas, should that be tied to schools reopening?
I think very much so. Here in Oregon, we kept being told that schools, is once the teachers, once we hit certain metrics for COVID cases, schools would reopen. Once the teachers got vaccinated, schools would reopen. And so they're for parents feeling like, okay, it's going to happen. It's going to happen in a couple of weeks from now. For parents, it kept feeling like we're going to open, and then it didn't. And the teachers continued to get what they requested and what they needed. And I am very supportive of teachers having vaccines and the safe reopening and the metrics being in the right, place for the community to be safe.
Yeah.
But what is hard for me as a parent is, what can I trust? What can I trust of the public school system? And that is why we've had to move 2 of our children to a private school system, because I know what I'm going to get there, and I know what's going to happen. And so, as money does come out to the public school system, which I also support because I know that's going to help my daughter, but reopen. I mean,
right,
we still haven't gotten a commitment to reopen.
Of course. Well, Ms. Dale, thank you very much. And very quickly, I know I've only got about 30 seconds left of this answer, but Mr. Moriel, during your opening statement, you were talking about how we need statewide testing just to be able to tell where our students are at this time. I was wondering, do you think coming out of this pandemic, do you think that we should continue to utilize these standardized tests, which, I feel like sometimes or is it like asking a fish to climb a tree, whereas it doesn't mean the fish isn't is talented, it just means he can't climb a tree. Do you think that there could be a different form of testing that would be more beneficial for our students?
10 seconds.
Testing can always improve, but right now it's the best thing we have to see where our students are. And not only that, to identify gaps within a school district, within a school. With the data, you can tell whether the performance differentials are at the school level, at the classroom level, or within a particular school district within a state. I think right now, can testing improve? Yes, but what we have now is better than nothing.
Fantastic. Well, Mr. Morial, Mrs.
Thank
Dale,
you.
thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I think Miss Hayes of Connecticut has joined us. So Miss Hayes, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Johanna.
And I appreciate you holding this very important hearing. I think it's safe to say that no one, if we had it our way, no one would want us to be in the situation that we're in now. And we want our children to be safe. My son, actually, his school went back to full in-person, and within 2.5 weeks, he's now home again for a 10-day quarantine because one of his classmates tested positive for COVID. And just today, my cousin who's at work asked me to leave the office to go get her daughter because the teacher tested positive and the school sent out a notice to parents that they're shutting down. So the idea that Democrats are okay with schools being closed is just a false choice. Every single one of us wants our children to go back to school. My questions today, Superintendent Carvalho, you made a statement about at your school. One of the things that they did was supplement the SAT and ACT testing. And I too am concerned about what the annual standardized tests look like for this year. So it's an issue that I continue to try to gather information on, because in my district and from my own perspective as a career educator, one of the things that I know is that these high stakes, high pressure tests, which are our best tool for collecting information, we've heard this year about all the gaps in learning that we've seen. So now for kids to be expected to perform at the highest level and be measured by these tests is deeply concerning, and I think will be unfairly punitive. So my question for you, Superintendent Carvalho, is as the superintendent of one of the largest school districts in the country, have you heard any concerns from your educators or parents surrounding the issue of standardized testing? Or have you sought to seek feedback about how we can make this better and make sure that the information is used in the way in which it is intended?
Thank you very much for your question, Representative Hayes. We certainly have. And number one, I'm sorry for what you described earlier, the impact of COVID on your family. And I'd like to express also, my absolute understanding and compassion for the testimony of Ms. Dell and what she has gone through. Specifically to your question, yes, I've heard from many parents and from many educators, not only in Miami-Dade, but across the state and the country, with certain significant concerns about standardized assessments this year. And not only the assessment itself, but toward what end will you assess, and will there be punitive actions and consequences as a result of that data? We have taken, as a school board, based on policy and administratively, a number of steps. We've communicated with our state regarding our concerns specific to the utilization of test data this year for the reasons that you alluded to. And I'll just mention a couple more. Number one, COVID-19 has impacted differently different areas of the country. Even within one state or one county, the impacts have been uneven. So the expectation that the environmental educational conditions would be the same across the board for all students, all grade levels, all schools is just a fallacy. Secondly, the issue that was mentioned earlier, the quarantine impact on whole cohorts of students in schools has been disparate from school to school, sometimes within the same school, certainly across districts. What I'm referring to is that there will be an issue of validity and reliability associated with the data that will emanate from this year's standardized assessment. That is why the gold standard of American assessment, which is the NAEP, as an organization, as a board, it canceled its administration for these very same reasons. Now, in the state of Florida, and I understand what Mr. Morial said, and I agree, we need to know where our students are. We need to know where our students are. We need to identify the gaps if, in fact, we are to develop strategies to eliminate those gaps and to accelerate students towards their full potential. So we don't depend only on summative assessments, which are these standardized assessments at the end of the year. We also depend on formative assessments, on assessments delivered by teachers themselves, so that we know, rather than waiting until the end of the year, where our students are, where the gaps are, where the regression exists, where the learning loss is, and actively and timely intervene. My hope is that as a result of our advocacy with the state, and on the basis of the waiver opportunity that the federal government has offered to the states, that to the extent that assessments are administered and the state of Florida is moving forward with its assessments, that the window for
Antoinette, I'm
assessments.
sorry, my time is about to run out. I don't mean to cut you off, but you just said everything that I know to be true. We saw that the SATs and ACTs in most places have been cut off, and any good teacher is doing formative assessments on an ongoing basis. So I really hope that we have a more robust conversation so that we are in fact measuring what we are intended to measure. Because my son's standardized test, standardized is we standardize it, everything about it. But it would be a measure of what I taught him this year and not his teacher or his school. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Yeah, thank you, Jana. Actually, my daughter, as a teacher, has told me that they are, at least she is, identifying students in her class who may need to go to summer school. And yeah, so good work. I'd like to, let me see, Mrs. Miller, I think Mrs. Miller has joined us. Mrs. Miller?
Yes, thank you. I'm back and
Oh,
forth
thank
between,
you.
thank you. I'm between multiple committees. So,
Yes.
thank you for bearing with. I have a question for Mrs. Dale. Mrs. Dale, thank you for your testimony. And in your testimony, you shared that you began engaging in grassroots advocacy to get students back in school. I was wondering how your efforts were received by school board members and lawmakers.
Thank you for your question, Representative Miller. In the beginning, what we heard, so this was back in September and October when we launched some of these efforts, we got kind of form responses, template responses that said we're hearing an equal amount of people who want to go back and people who don't want to go back. And so the response in the beginning wasn't very optimistic that there would be a choice to return. But what we continually advocated for was that students who needed to go back and needed that option to return to school were given the choice to return, so that the comprehensive distance learning would continue for those teachers and staff and students that were doing okay in distance learning, but that the choice to return to in-person in a safe way was provided. And there was a statewide mandate in Oregon that was not lifted until January 1st of this year. And so it was never even a possibility or a consideration, even at a local school level.
So may I ask another question? Why do you believe, in light of the science being clear, that reopening schools is safe? Why do you believe schools are not open?
I think that's the hardest question for all of us as parents. But I think that two reasons. I think one is that from what I've learned over the last 6 to 7 months, and this was nothing that I had ever gotten involved in before. I am very involved in my child's education, but not in this manner. But over the last 6 or 7 months, what we discovered was, kids don't vote. And so there was really no child representation. There wasn't anybody coming to the table to say, this is what's happening with our children and with our kids and why our kids were suffering. I think that was one issue. And I think the other issue is that, and I alluded to this just a little bit earlier, is that there are contracts in place with teachers and with teachers unions that really precluded our kids from having the opportunity and the choice to go back to school. So for example, there were work from home agreements that teachers had signed, and there were anytime a school tried to reopen. So when our school district tried to reopen in February, the teachers union went out and placed ads and and went to the newspapers and said that it was being rushed and that they weren't consulted with going back. And so they opposed returning to in-person learning. And so I think that from our perspective, is at least all I can really speak to is my perspective as a parent and for my kids, is that there just wasn't there was a lot of inertia around going back. There wasn't this leadership and effort to figure out, well, how do we make it possible for some of our kids to get back in person learning?
Thank you, Mrs. Dale. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Manning. Again, let me see. I'm gonna call out Mr. Cawthorn one more time. Mrs. Steele. All right, Mr. Ballman, sir. You on, Mr. Ballman? Going once. And now the most patient full committee chair and member of Congress, Chairman Bobby Scott. Sir, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, I'd like to respond to comment in his opening statement by the ranking member. He talked about political interference. I certainly agree with his comments and would like to enter into the record an outline of the original CDC guidelines for meatpacking plants, and then the final CDC guidelines after the Trump administration White House got involved. There's a stark difference. And I'd also like to enter into the record the present CDC guidelines about 3 feet difference. It doesn't say you can suddenly go to 3 feet. It says you can go to 3 feet if you are complying with other guidelines like mask wearing and everything else. I like those.
Without objection.
Record.
Without objection.
Mr. Morial, thank you for Mark. Whoops. Well, let me ask the superintendent from Dade County, Mr. Carvalho. Comments have been made about the fact that money has been allocated to your district based on this Title I formula. Obviously, you got a lot of money for your district that could not have possibly been budgeted. Can we count on you showing a significant difference in as a result of, in terms of results, because of this money? It's a lot of money, and if we don't show some good results, we'll never hear the end of it. And I can assure you, you'll never get that kind of money again. You're on mute, Mr.
Yeah. Thank you. Representative Scott, you can count on me. You can count on the 40,000 employees of this school system and 20,000 dedicated teaching professionals to do so. Look, I'm a recession superintendent. I lived through the Great Recession of 2008-9, where we had to shave hundreds of millions of dollars from our budget. And had it not been for the race to the top investments, some of the soaring results that I described probably would not have happened. And I can tell you that some of the best practices that arose from those investments are still being felt in this school system today. Secondly, we approach the decisions on the utilization of these resources very carefully, in full consultation with our board, who via policy actually requires a plan, a time plan for the expenditures with an exact knowledge of how those investments are going to be made, toward what end, what is the expected objective, goal, and benefit.
Okay, I'm sorry, limited time. We've talked about the chance of continuing the allocations. It's my understanding that virtually all of the money, although not spent, has been allocated. When you hire a teacher, how long do you hire a teacher for?
Well, sir, when we hire a teacher, we hope to hire a teacher for a lifetime, but because of their commitment. The The funds, the way they've been earmarked to us, the first level, ESSER 1, we've spent 70% of those dollars. We just received the second allocation under the previous administration, and we now know that the most massive investment in the history of education in this country, which for Miami-Dade exceeds about $1 billion, has been announced. And we're going to absolutely be cautious, careful in monitoring those expenditures, and strategic to live up to your challenge to me, which is these dollars will make a difference in terms of accelerating every single student to their full potential.
A lot of comment has been made. A lot of comment has been made about the fact that the money hasn't been spent. When you hire a teacher today, you don't actually spend the money.
No,
for
sir.
some time.
School districts are, you're correct, sir. School districts obviously annualize expenditures, but the expenditure is timed with its consumption. So obviously, on the first month of a teacher's work, you would expect about 1/8 of that allocation to have been spent. But I can tell you one thing, there's a difference between expenditures and encumbered. A lot of funds have been spent, a lot of funds have been encumbered, but it is timed in accordance, obviously, with their utilization, particularly if funds are attached to professionals, to human beings.
I wanted to ask Mark Mariello a question. I see he's back. At the end of his testimony, he was talking about the need for statewide assessments. Can he explain why the Urban League is supporting statewide assessments?
Yeah, he's seems to be on, but his camera is off.
I'm here.
Oh, there he
No,
is.
here,
There he
yeah,
is.
yeah. I had to take care of a personal matter. Congressman, thank you for your question. And I've heard the testimony. We could debate the when a statewide assessment should be taken, but we have to know where the gaps are. We have to understand where the disparities exist. And school leaders also need, and parents need, transparency. Certainly, it's going to demonstrate that many students have lost ground. But what that will do is it will, if you will, provide the evidence for the investments in the kind of strategies to close these gaps. And I think we'll demonstrate why continued investment in Title I and other, if you will, interventions and other supports for students of color, for low and moderate income students, for English language learners are so essential. We have to have tools. We cannot fly the plane without using radar. Debate the when, whether it should happen in the beginning of next school year, debate the specifics. I'm not in love with standardized tests. No one is. I have nightmares from taking the bar exam still. But the point is we have to have common tools. Teacher assessments are extremely valuable, but not a common tool. And we need common tools to determine. I would certainly say there's a lot to debate about the methodology of testing, about the pressure on kids around testing, but we gotta have data. And I do not want disparities to be masked. So we don't know where they are. We don't understand how they play out. If we're gonna be serious about addressing systemic inequities in this country.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a document published by the National Education Association in 2016 describing how you can do assessments, talking about eliminating high stakes testing and providing more local control and testing as we did in Every Student Succeeds Act, so that people will know that we're not talking about the imposition of standardized tests. We're talking about making sure that we have the assessments so we know where the learning has to take place. We have provided the money according to the Title I formula, so the money's going where it's most needed. And you can't, as our business friends tell us, you can't manage what you don't measure.
Thank you. Without objection, so ordered. And Mr. Chairman, your 5 minutes is up. Thank you. So we'll do some housekeeping matters here. I would like to remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, materials for submission for the hearing record must be submitted to the committee clerk within 14 days following the last day of this hearing. So by close of business on May 8, 2021, preferably in Microsoft Word format. The materials submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing, and only a member of the subcommittee or an invited witness may submit materials for inclusion in the hearing record. Documents are limited to 50 pages each. Documents longer than 50 pages will be incorporated into the record via an internet link that you must provide to the committee clerk within the required time frame, but please recognize that in the future, that link may no longer work. Pursuant to House rules and regulations, items for the record should be submitted to the clerk electronically by emailing submissions to edanlabor.hearings@mail.house.gov. Again, edanlabor.hearings@mail.house.gov. Member offices are encouraged to submit materials to the inbox before the hearing or during the hearing at the time the member makes the request. Now, again, I want to thank the witnesses for their participation today. All of you made huge contributions to this subcommittee, and members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for you, and we ask the witnesses to please respond to these questions in writing. The hearing record will be held open for 14 days in order to receive these responses. I remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, witness questions for the hearing record must be submitted to the majority committee staff or committee clerk within 7 days. The questions submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member for a closing statement.
Okay, 1 second here, hold tight. Bear with me.
Mr. Owens, yes?
Yes, I'm 1 second, having a little bit of, okay. First of all, Mr. Chairman, thank you once again. Before, so I would like to kind of clear the record, a little narrative that I'm finding very disturbing over the decades about a race that I am so proud to be part of and a history that I'm so proud to reflect upon, that there was this narrative that for some reason, because we're in a segregated community, that we were a hapless race that could not overcome the oppressive white race. I want to clear that. I grew up in Tallahassee, Florida, deep South, community that was remarkably successful. Even though we were segregated, we had the same thoughts about our country that other communities did, even though we were not assimilating at the time. Whether it be the Italian or German, we loved our country, we believed in meritocracy, and we believed in the tenets that made our community great, and we did not trust government. We believed there's a God in heaven, we believed that education, the family unit, and capitalism was our way out. And guess what? The 40s and 50s and 60s, we proved that. So I want everybody to remember these statistics as we talk about my race, because it has been something that's happened since the 60s, has gotten to where we are. It's not the color of our skin, it's not what happened 200 years ago. And in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was my community, a Black community, that led our country to growth in the middle class. Men matriculated for college. Men committed to marriage was 70%. So no, we didn't have the problem of the single mothers that we now have today. Men knew what it was to man up and take care of their families. We also led our country in the growth of the middle class because we had the highest percentage of entrepreneurs, over 40%. So I want you to keep that in context as we now look at what's happened to our nation and what's happening to the lack of education that we're now experiencing. So that being said, and I also want to say this to Mr. Kadohar, I hope I pronounced that right. Thank you for what you've done in Miami-Dade. Thank you. You represent so many of our great leaders and teachers who truly do love your profession, and you proved that during this last year. Unfortunately, there's so many people out there that take this profession and they don't. And I would say to Jennifer, she would have loved to have had your kind of leadership up in her state, because Lizzie would have had a different result over the last year. Okay, that being said, Mr. Chairman, thank you again for calling this hearing, for the witnesses, for offering your expertise today. This has truly been a great hearing, but I am frustrated with a couple of things I've heard. First, I'm frustrated that the answer to for my Democratic friends for what children have experienced this last year is just to dump a whole lot more money into the same system that's failed students for so many generations. In 1992, Mr. Chairman, Black 12th graders scored 24 points lower than white students in reading. In 2019, it scored 32 points lower. In 2017, the Department of Education, State of California, stated that 75% of Black boys could not pass standard reading and writing tests. This has nothing to do with the color of their skin. It has to do with policies and the failures of a teacher union whose responsibility is to never allow this to happen. It blows my mind that Democrats seem to think that all they have to do is dump a whole lot of money into the same system that's failed us. We need to change that. Second of all, I'm glad to see that my Democratic friends are finally supporting the need to reopen schools. I welcome this conversation. But Mr. Chairman, our families do not need our words. They need our actions. When Republicans proposed requiring school districts to reopen schools in order to receive federal COVID aid, every single Democrat voted no. 5 times Democrats voted no on reopening schools for all students. Your party voted no on reopening schools for the most vulnerable students, including students with disabilities. The Democrats voted no on allowing parents with children in closed schools to use their per student share of public funds to find other educational options. Your party voted no on requiring teachers unions and school districts to be transparent about reopening negotiations. And Democrats voted no on reopening when all teachers in a district had access to the vaccine. 5 times to show that Democrats believe in science. 5 times to show that Democrats care about the harm being done to our children. 5 times to show Democrats' newfound enthusiasm for reopening school isn't based on a sudden realization that the party is in political peril. And 5 times Democrats said no. So Mr. Chair, I appreciate you holding these hearings. I appreciate the opportunity to amplify the impact that this last year have had on families. I hope my friends across the aisle will put into action behind these words the next time they have the opportunity. And the last little point, I grew up again in Tallahassee. I was the 3rd Black to go to the University of Miami. I left there with a degree in biology. In my community in the 60s, that was not weird. It was not unheard of. We expected success because we wanted to reflect great on our community, on our race, and to succeed. Today, that would be found almost unbelievable that a Black young man could go and play football and graduate a degree that will be respected across our country. That should never happen in our country. We need to make sure that those that are most at risk are given an opportunity, like everybody else, no matter what their zip code is, to have the American dream of education and the choice. And thank you for those out there who's giving our kids across our country and our parents choice this last year. That is truly the American way, and I thank you for that opportunity. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Owens. I'm not going to respond to your comments, but I want to thank our witnesses again for taking the time to be with us. Again, each one of you has made very good contributions to our hearing today. Today's hearing confirmed that the COVID-19 relief funding that Congress has secured over the last year has been critical to addressing the immediate challenges of the pandemic for schools. We're not expecting that there would be miracles here, but they were immediate. They addressed the challenges, the additional challenges of COVID-19. We also heard how the American Rescue Plan in particular is finally providing schools with the funding they need to reopen classrooms safely, keep classrooms open, and help students overcome the far-reaching consequences of school closures. Finally, our discussions confirm what we have heard from our relief efforts so far, that Congress must continue to target resources to the schools and students who need them most. School communities cannot fully recover from this pandemic unless we confront persistent educational disparities that has been exacerbated by the pandemic. We certainly have a clear path to finally achieve educational equity as we slowly emerge from this global health emergency. I look forward to taking historic steps along with all of you, alongside my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, to ensure that every student has access to an education that allows them to reach their full potential. And I go back right now to, I remember the hearing we had like 3 Congress ago when we had a GAO official testify about the status of Native American schools, because somebody mentioned, I think it was Mr. Groffman mentioned how families generation ago, how we should look at that, the status of Native American schools in our country. And it is embarrassing. It is so unfair to what we have done to the indigenous people of our America. But I want to thank you all for this also coming from the territories. It's now 10 o'clock to 6 in the morning, almost time for me to get up from bed. But it's always good. Very important committee. Everyone, thank you for joining us. And this meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.